Welcome to the webinar or the conference talk show. There is all kinds of craziness going on this morning. My phone stole my headphone. This is what happens when you're live, but that's okay because this is the conference talk show where we talk about things like what do you do when things just go wrong? Mostly you go with the flow. I'm Liz Green. Welcome to the conference talk show.
And I'm Tom Singer, and Eliz and I have been hosting this show as a great way to talk about everything to do with events. You know, we've had a tough 17 months for the people who work in and around live events, and just as it's looking like things are opening up, who knows? There's the Delta variant, and so we don't know what the future holds.
Yeah, just when we were sort of getting a little comfortable with the idea that things might be going back to normal, whatever that is. Yeah, I was listening to the daily podcast this morning, which was about the Delta variant. And yeah, it's just unpredictable.
I am attending an event next week, and I'm assuming the event is happening. The event seems to be assuming the event is happening, but
right.
It's 8 days away, and so I have no idea if it's going to happen or not. We're kind of back to that unknown era that we experienced a while ago.
Well, which is all the more reason to plan a hybrid event. This is one of the things that you and I talk about with clients all the time. If you're planning a hybrid event, it does allow you to have some flexibility in if you need to go fully virtual, at least you have set that up. I don't think it's going to come to that. I am still optimistic that we are going to be able to have hybrid and in-person events. We may be a little more careful about it than we thought we were going to have to. And you and I both attended an in-person event. We saw each other in person. That was pretty cool.
It was. There were about 500 people at the National Speakers Association annual conference called Influence. And for the most part, it seemed like the old days, right? I mean, there were less people there than we normally had, but the event itself still felt like the annual conference that NSA puts on. We got to see a lot of friends and things like that. But, you know, then afterwards, there was an email that came out that said, you know, a couple of people got home and weren't feeling well and tested positive. So it's now been 2 weeks, so I feel that I dodged the bullet. But there definitely has been some concern amongst people that, wow, we were vaccinated, you know, we took precautions, and people still, you know, whether at the conference or on the airplane or in the hotel lobby, they still somewhere acquired, this virus. So and even being vaccinated, we still have to be super, super careful.
That's exactly right. And I think one of the very smart things that NSA did was give us all buttons, or allow us to have. I mean, we weren't required to wear them, but buttons that were about that big, had a little magnetic attachment so you didn't have to pin it through your clothes, which is always appreciated. And they were red, yellow, and green that allowed you to signal to other people how comfortable you were interacting in this new environment. And I thought it worked really well. The red was sort of like, hey, I'm going to wave at you from 6 feet. I'm really happy to see you, but I'm going to stay over here. And to be fair, there were some people who wore masks throughout the conference. I liked the environment of whatever you're going to choose, it's going to be fine. Yellow.
Yeah, whatever your comfort level is, everybody else was cool with. And I think that's kind of where we have to be as a society.
That's absolutely right. So the green ones were like, hey, I can't wait to hug you. And yellow, which is where I was like, I'm going to need to have a little conversation before we're engaging. And as you know, I have been very, very careful, being high risk, very careful. So this was a very, I talk about uncertainty a lot. It was a very uncertain environment for me. So I had one of those yellow buttons. I really became more comfortable with giving people I knew were vaccinated a hug. I was not shaking hands. Like I may never go back to shaking hands. So there was a lot of elbow bumping. There was one tushy bump, that sort of interaction. I think really figuring out where your own personal comfort level is is really important, but also designing a way for people to signal that to one another. I know some events use wristbands, but that is less visible than that big button, which really allowed people, like, people would be like, "Oh, you have a yellow." I'm like, I know you're vaccinated, but whatever it is. It
So
was
my wife Sarah's a meeting planner for a local association in Austin, and she had her first live event, I don't know, 2 months ago, something like that. And she had stickers that were the same thing, red, yellow, and green, and people put it on. But it was amazing. I mean, this was back in June or maybe even May. It was interesting to see. Now, granted, we're in Texas, and you can take that for what you want, but it was interesting to see the people in green stickers. They were just like massive hugs. You know, people just coming right in. The yellows had to be like, whoa, give me a break. But what's interesting is I didn't see this at the National Speakers Association very much, and I didn't see it at any other local event I've been to. So the people who are coming, they're yellow or green. If they're red, they tend not to be showing up in person. I think they're skipping it.
Yeah, that may be the case. You're right. I didn't see very many reds. I saw a lot of yellows, and I actually saw people who turned in their greens and got a yellow. Just like, I just want to have a conversation before we're engaging in a hug. And that may be something goes forward.
Kind of a huggy crowd, right? So if you had the green button, they weren't cool. You had like hug coming at you. So you definitely had to make those choices. But it is interesting as we are sitting at this position now in the middle of 2021, that we have to look for how do we properly engage people where they are, whether it's in person or virtual. This whole idea of keeping people coming to events, either in a hybrid or an in-person, situation, is super important for associations and other organizations that rely on events as part of their education, as part of their marketing, as part of their income. So keeping people engaged, super important. And the thing we all have to remember is we've all had very different experiences. You have a pre-existing health condition that caused you to have to be more cautious than me. Although both of us are, I'll say this out loud, we're in our mid-50s, so we're just under that cusp of where we had to be careful with that. Everybody experienced it differently from what they brought into the pandemic, also their experiences. Some people lost loved ones. Some people got really sick. Some people had their businesses really hit and impacted, like people in the meetings business. And other people, the biggest problem they had was they had to work from home, and maybe their kids were around too much, but their paychecks still came. They didn't know anyone who got sick. They didn't get sick. And we have to remember that there are so many different experiences that people have had coming into this pandemic that as we come out of it, knock wood, as we come out, we have to be understanding that everyone's coming from a different place.
That's absolutely right. And going forward, we do need to design events in a way that honors that. And I know you talk a lot about how to get people to create that community, to connect and collaborate, which I think we're all really hungry for after this last, almost year and a half. I think the National Speakers Association did some cool things in order to help make that possible. What are your thoughts on what worked, and what do you think maybe as we move forward we need to add?
Well, so I think, one of the things that worked was they had the hybrid event. So there was the option to come into the event virtually and participate in all of the breakout sessions. In fact, all of the breakout sessions were virtual. But if you were virtual, you could watch the main stage stuff that was going on in the ballroom. So I think that they did a really good job of offering both. They also set it up where not everything had to be there. One of the mistakes people make with hybrid is they think, all we have to do is broadcast everything. They had certain things that weren't broadcast because either the speaker didn't want it to be recorded or want it to be broadcast, or just for logistical reasons of the time it took place or something else. So realizing that there is when you do hybrid, there's a virtual event, there's an in-person event, and sometimes they overlap and sometimes they have to be separate. So I thought they did a really good job with that. Another thing I thought that they did a really good job with was, because everything, they didn't have the breakouts, everything was in that main ballroom, it did create a sense of community that existed because everybody was brought together. Now on the flip side, they held it, and this was planned 3 years in advance, long before we ever dreamed of a pandemic, but they held it at Caesar's Palace.
Right.
And Caesars has a very nice conference center. That was great. But the hotel was so large that at night there was no single gathering spot, whereas a smaller
really
hotel, there would be a lobby bar that everybody could go to. So I definitely think that when you're selecting places, you need to think not just about the ballroom space, but you
Right.
also have to think about what's going to happen, at 10 o'clock when someone wants to go have a glass of wine and run into people from the conference. That was sort of impossible at this event.
It was, and it was unexpectedly busy in Las Vegas as well. I mean, there were just
There
a
was a
lot
fight.
of people.
Yeah. There was a big fight that weekend. The Kardashians were there for the fight. I saw a crowd of people, and someone was like, "Oh, it's Kim Kardashian," and I was like, I didn't chase her down because she doesn't return my calls. So,
well, but I take your point, especially since I sit on the influence planning committee. So that creating a space for people to congregate informally, not like here's the spot where we're going to do this, but creating spaces where people can get together in that informal setting, because we all know that hallway conversation or the conversation at the bar is often the biggest takeaway from a conference. So creating that space is important.
So I had an idea that you think of these things in hindsight, but I had an idea that I thought would work if you were having a convention in a large resort where there were going to be a lot of people not affiliated with you. I was remembering back to my days when I was in my college fraternity, and I had the honor a couple of times to go to the national convention. The problem was, if you can imagine, a 4 or 5 star hotel with 1,000 college students as the convention. Where many of them were under 21 years old. So, you and who could afford a hotel bar when you were in college?
Right.
It was probably $4 drinks back then, and we would have gone like, oh my God, they're not 99 cents. And what they used to do in order to keep the room noise down in the hotel itself is they would negotiate with the hotel that there was a breakout room where people could just go to. And they didn't have an open bar, or a bar, but people would bring booze in, and security would kind of look the other way to keep the noise somewhere else. I was thinking you could do a modified version of that for a conference of grown-ups, where you could at night have a ballroom with a cash bar. You don't have to have an open bar. You get a cash bar where you create sort of your own private lobby bar, and then at night people could come, and the cost would really be just the cost of having a bartender on duty for a few hours.
Right. Well, and we've talked about doing something similar like that, but perhaps even offering that as a sponsorship opportunity. That,
creating
sponsored by, here's the lounge sponsored by whatever group. It would work, by the way, for coffee as well, because, the line at the coffee shop tends to be pretty long in the morning. If you could have some sort of sponsored fancy drink coffee situation, that would be good.
You've already thought about this from the standpoint of being on the planning committee. I'm just sort of spitballing it in my head. But if you think about it, if you're in a large area and you have a place where you had tables and chairs, sort of a coffee shop by day, bar at night, where people can go and hang out, and even if they had to buy their own coffee and buy their own stuff, but you create that lounge area where it's just the people at your conference. Number one, you're creating community, giving people a chance to have a place to go during those off hours. And number two, you're keeping everybody away from maybe being exposed to COVID or whatever else is out there, because they're not out with the whole population. So there might be a great idea in that for an organization.
I like that idea. I wrote that down because that was something we talked about and weren't able to do this year. Just there were a lot of constraints planning a conference in Las Vegas at the end of a pandemic. Hopefully it's the end of the pandemic. But thank you for reminding me of that, because I wrote it down so we can do that. Let's talk about some of the ways that we connected the virtual audience and the in-person audience. One of the things that I thought was really cool, which came I think out of the winter conference that we talked about before was everybody was encouraged to be in the chat on the app. So we all had it on our phone or on our laptop or wherever. In person and virtual were encouraged to be on the app together in the chat, which I thought was really fun. And then our MCs, we had 3 MCs, which we can talk about that in a second, would reference the chat or ask a question in the chat, and everybody could participate in that, which I thought worked pretty well. I was backstage the whole time. I know you were very active in the chat.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, and it was at the winter conference for the National Speakers Association where I first saw this happen, but I've now seen a couple of other organizations do it too. And they get the people in the ballroom to turn off the volume on their phone, but log on to the broadcast so that they can be participating in that chat. And then you're chatting away going, oh, that was a good point. And someone else goes, hey, Tom, how are you? You're able to chat with your friends who might be thousands of miles away. That actually helps build that sense of community. It makes the people in the virtual audience feel they're so distant if they're able to connect with people who are there in person, and vice versa. I think everybody then can feel included, like it is one conference to some extent.
Right, and that's the whole point, right? That we're attending together even though we may not be in the exact same place. Some of our MCs did, well, they all engaged with the people in the chat while on stage. There were a couple of moments I thought were really, really cool. So I know on this show we've talked about the 4 different duties of a MC, production MC, driver MC that really is, so the producer is backstage making sure everything works. The driver MC is the type of MC we're used to seeing, introducing people, doing the outro, keeping everything on track, hopefully staying on time. Then we had a connection MC, which is really that connecting those 2 different audiences together and connecting them to the content. And then a wow MC, which is really about adding some sort of entertainment or poignant moment to the whole thing. So our connection MC was Omekongo Dibinga. And in full disclosure, we were running 10 minutes late, or 10 minutes early, which is unheard of. 10 minutes early on the first night,
And there was a reception afterwards, so you can't just let the people out early because the bartenders aren't ready.
And the food wasn't ready. So our event staff were like, oh my gosh, we're 10 minutes early. We can't let them out. And of course, as professional speakers and MCs, we were all like, that is never a problem.
We got that.
We got you. It's going to be fine. But it was deciding what we were going to do. So Patty Hendrickson had already planned to do something on stage. She made it a little bit longer. And then Omekongo, we asked, can you do something with the chat? And we were bouncing around ideas. And the most brilliant thing is, like, he just said, can I just do what I want? I'm like, yes, maybe I should just get out of the way of brilliance. He did what he called rap in a box. He went out, asked people to put into the chat words that described the first day of the conference, and then rapped for like 4.5 minutes brilliantly, completely extemporaneously. So that was a connection and a wow.
And in order to do that, you have to have a great AV team, because what they were able to do is pull the chat down onto the confidence monitor so that as he walked around the stage and created this rap, he could see all the words going by in the chat without having to be staring down at his phone or looking over his shoulder at what was on the screen behind him. So I thought that on the fly, everybody just jumped in and made it all work. And of course, you got to have that skill to be a sort of a beatbox rapper on the spot. And that's sort of how he got his start. He's a storyteller who has just a unique way of being able to build words together. So it was awesome.
It was incredible. It was a reminder to me that sometimes you just need to get out of the way and let people do what they do well. And but you're right about the AV team. We had Video West, and maybe we need to invite Brady, who was our producer. I don't know that I have ever worked with an AV team where it was so comfortable working with them, I never heard a raised voice. And to be sure, there were things that happened that were stressful. Never a raised voice, very kind words all of the time, lots of thank yous. It was just a pleasure to work with them.
So the other thing I thought that was a really good job that really did create the ability to be engaged was the way your team, who was the committee that put this together, did a great job of curating different things on stage. So there were short speeches that were 2 minutes. We called them sort of permanent pits, where people came up and gave a 2-minute tip. There were people who did sort of deeper dives that were maybe 5 or 7 minutes on like different business models. And then there were shorter keynotes that were like 20 minutes. There were longer keynotes that were closer to an hour, or maybe they were an hour. Everybody was so good, it goes by fast. Yeah. And then we had some interviews, and then we did a live broadcast of the National Speakers Association's podcast, where we actually interviewed the 3 MCs and you as the producer of the show about how to be a great MC. And we're going to pull that audio and make it a release of Speakernomics, which is NSA's podcast. And I thought that that was an interesting thing. And it's something I've talked to clients about too, is live interviews. And if you have a podcast, or if you can partner with somebody in your industry who has one, where you can pull the audio from that live stage and make it, just creates a different animal. I think it went over. Now I'm a little biased. I was the facilitator of that discussion, but I went back and watched it, and I think it went really, really well for both the audience who was in the ballroom or virtual, and when it's released as a podcast, in the next few weeks. I think the same thing. Everybody's going to walk away with real content, and that's the thing is that there's always been an argument, as long as I've been in the meetings business, of are panels great or do panels suck? And the actual answer is panels are great when it's a great panel. And it's moderated correctly, and there's real forethought and planning that's put into how are we going to do this to make it a win for the audience. And I think NSA did a great job of having lots of different formats so that people could be engaged in different styles.
Well, and I think having the podcast highlighted on stage, it's a relatively new switch of how we used to provide that kind of content to this podcast model, and it's even called something different than it has been in the past. It's really shifted. I would like to say everybody knows about it, but highlighting it on the main stage absolutely elevates it. So thinking about what are the best kept secrets of your association or organization that need to be highlighted, and how can you do that in a really engaging way? We talk about value-centered engagement all of the time. And to me, that means, how are you providing things at your conference that dig deep and people can walk away feeling like they really got something special that was intentionally for them and that they can take action on? So that was really, when we were looking at what are we going to put on the main stage, that was a big filter that we used. Is this relevant? Is it actionable? Is it different than what we've seen before? And that's a high bar.
Well, and I know that NSA did this, and I'm working with another client who's trying to do the same thing, and that is getting away from always using the same usual suspects, if you will, the same people who have always, from your organization, been on stage. And I know, obviously, there's some exceptions, and you have to have some of your legendary people there. But as you guys were choosing the main keynotes, I know that was a huge thing. It was very interesting in what was leading up to it, because people were like, well, I was listening to some of the chatter in different online things, and people were like, oh, I don't know any of these speakers, so I don't know if it's going to be any good. And it's like, well, just because you don't know them doesn't mean they're not awesome. And then afterwards, the chatter was like, wow, the content was so great. So I think shaking it up and putting some new voices on stage, especially as we're coming out of this pandemic, I think it's a way for associations to re-energize themselves, let the next generation sort of take the bull by the horns, if you will, and really get out there and expose new people to new thought leaders in your organization. So being intentional about that, I think, goes a long way.
I agree. And my having gone through this process of working so closely with the NSA staff as we planned this, and other clients as well, if you have a filter that you're very conscious about when you're making decisions about what you're going to put on the main stage, what are you going to use in your breakouts. I mean, for us, it can't be usual suspects, or at least we wanted 70% of the speakers that we put on the main stage not to be the usual suspects. That it had to be, our theme was radically relevant. And it was really the filter that the committee was using, and it ended up like being on the stage. I'm like, wow, that's kind of fun. But and we chose that, just in case you were wondering, before the pandemic. It just was more poignant at that moment. So radically relevant really meant that it is not the same information that we've received over and over and over again. So if you're going to have something on marketing, it has to be something new about marketing, not the same old recycled stuff. If you're going to have something on sales, it can't be the same thing that we've heard about sales all the time. And it was really interesting, especially when we came to choosing the deeper dives, which was what we called our virtual breakouts. There were a lot of people who submitted programs about how to do Zoom better. And that's not radically relevant anymore. If after, 15 months you're not good at Zoom, well, that's not good. And you can find a bazillion recordings about how to be better on Zoom. We need stuff that is really relevant right now.
And I think for associations in all industries, when you're doing the programming, don't program for the newest or most remedial levels. Right. Program for those people who are actively working. You don't have to program for the celebrities or the people knocking it out of the park either. Right. So program for the people who are, sort of the average, the average Joanne or the average Joe in your association. Program for the person who's out there doing the work but has a moderate level of success, and then the newer people can still learn from that. And so right. it helps rise up everybody. Too often we fall into Zoom 101, and it's like, well wait a minute, that's we should be past that in the organization.
Yeah, and there is a place for Zoom 101 or your expertise 101. There's a place for that, and really thinking about how are you nurturing those newer to the organization people is important, or even newer to the industry people is important as well. But it probably doesn't belong on the main stage. You could create a series of breakouts that serve the people if that's something that you need to do in your event. But I agree with you. It has to be a higher level of content if we're going to want our members, our established members, to feel like they got enough, that their attendance was valuable.
The only other thing before we wrap up that I would say that we didn't do with the National Speakers Association, it is a really good idea.
I got my pen ready.
Well, it's a little self-serving for you and I, but a really good idea if you are doing a hybrid event, have a separate MC whose job is to be the eyes and ears and to talk to the home audience, so that when you go to that hour-long coffee break or the hour and a half for lunch, you're not just putting up a slide for the at-home audience that's back in 90 minutes. That's when you engage the at-home audience by having those keynote speakers come in for one-on-one interviews specifically for the at-home audience, because it lets the at-home people feel like, hey, we're getting something special that the people there didn't get. And you can interview sponsors. You can interview the VIPs from your association. And one of the most fun things is you can interview people who are live attending about why it's so great. And you're subtly giving a little bit of FOMO, that fear of missing out. So people start making their plans to attend in person next time. So I think that that's something when you're doing hybrid, have a specific, we call it being like a talk show host, but have a specific person or people who can come on and do those interviews and really engage that at-home audience before the day begins, during the breaks, and then when everybody goes to happy hour.
Right. And I would have loved to be able to do that this year. But one of the constraints is when you're in a union house, you have to be careful with your time. And we couldn't have that time be broadcast. But we will have different constraints and not that one next year. So I love being able to do that sort of interview work. And in fact, if you wanted to find out how that works, you can find us over, other side, over there, conferencetalkshow.com. You can find about what Tom and I do, what I do, what Tom does, although we really do like to work together. And if you know somebody who has just hit it out of the park in terms of making your conference better this year, whether that's a speaker, an MC, a AV company, a hired event professional, pop over to conferenceheroaward.com and tell us about them. We would love to give them the Conference Hero Award. You can find us, conferencetalkshow.live on Facebook every Monday, most Mondays at 11 o'clock. Find us on YouTube at conferencetalkshow.watch. That was...
Half hour went by really fast. It always does.
Always does. We will see you next Monday. Have a great rest of your week.